Unlike a normal cannon, a railgun uses conductive rails and powerful electromagnetic currents to accelerate a projectile to astonishing speeds. This projectile itself is simple because much of the weapon's destructive power comes from its speed and kinetic impact. When that projectile strikes a target, its kinetic energy is converted into destruction. This makes the railgun especially interesting for spaceships where a weapon could fire solid projectiles across distances without needing explosives or, chemical propellants. Science fiction took this idea and turned it into everything from small firearms into gigantic ship-mounted weapons which are capable of punching through heavily armored warships. And of course, railguns are also often confused with coilguns, which uses electromagnetic coils rather than rails to accelerate similar projectiles. And they have somewhat of a similar concept, and science fiction here sometimes uses the names of these two, coilguns and railguns, interchangeably. The appeal of a railgun in space combat comes from the fact that they offer a different kind of weapon compared with missiles or energy weapons. They're like an in-betweener, a hybrid weapon that uses relatively advanced energy technology to shoot out a simple slug. Such a spaceship armed with this could carry large amounts of ammo, fire them at tremendous speeds, and attack targets with just kinetic force. This also connects railguns to the older idea of naval artillery. Science fiction often treats space warship combat much like, naval warfare with battleships, but here they replace gunpowder cannons with electromagnetic guns while retaining the same idea of naval warfare. One of the most interesting things about a railgun is that the projectile itself can be quite simple. A railgun doesn't really necessarily need an explosive warhead or something like that to destroy a spacecraft. The projectile can cause enormous damage simply by hitting the target at very high speed. The impact transfers its kinetic energy into the enemy ship, potentially punching through armor and damaging everything in between. This is known as kinetic kill, where the impact itself is the weapon rather than an explosion. However, accelerating a projectile to extreme speeds requires a tremendous amount of energy, and the weapon itself has to survive the enormous forces and heat produced during such firing. There's also the heat generation from such a weapon, as well as recoil, because even though the slugs are accelerated by electromagnetic forces, Newton's third law of motion still exists. But in science fiction, the railguns address these challenges by using exotic energy sources for, acceleration, novel coolant systems, and recoil dissipation technology. So anyway, here in this video now we will explore the different railguns from famous sci-fi settings and see how powerful they can get. Let's get to it. In the Expanse, railguns are amongst the most powerful ship-to-ship weapons aside from the Epstein-driven nuclear torpedoes. These electromagnetic cannons fire dense metal slugs, often described as tungsten, at enormous speeds, allowing the projectile to punch straight through a spacecraft rather than relying on an explosive warhead. Their power depends heavily on the size of the railgun, with lighter weapons capable of damaging larger ships through repeated hits, while the super heavy railguns carried by battleships can potentially destroy a smaller warship with a single well-placed shot. The scale becomes even more impressive when considering the stated speeds of some of these weapons, with a projectile reportedly covering around 1,000 kilometers in only a few seconds. At such velocities, even a relatively small 30 to 40 millimeter tungsten slug carries enormous kinetic energy, potentially reaching the equivalent of many tons of TNT in a single impact. However, the weapon's real strength is not simply its raw energy. A railgun projectile is extremely fast, accurate, and difficult to survive at close range, and if it passes through a critical section of a ship, it can cause catastrophic damage, and this makes the railgun the closest thing the Expanse has to a true space battleship gun. So these railguns are seen in many other different sci-fi settings. The ones seen in Stargate are similar in concept, but at the same time they have their own uniqueness and quirks. These here were developed by the Tauri, or Earthlings, in the year 2005, and these weapons use electromagnetic fields to accelerate solid metal slugs to high velocity. Their ammo capacity is one of the major strengths. A standard railgun magazine can hold around 10,000 rounds, while the gun can fire roughly 500 rounds per minute, which gives it about 20 minutes of continuous fire before the magazine is emptied. The weapons are also capable of firing at around Mach 5, which makes them particularly useful against smaller and fast-moving targets like the Wraith darts or the Goa'uld jet fighters. Their high rate of fire allows a spacecraft such as the Daedalus or the George Hammond to put a large volume of kinetic fire into an area, effectively turning the railguns into heavy point defense artillery. The power behind these weapons is not really given in precise figures, but their launch system obviously requires a substantial amount of electrical power. They were initially important ship-to-ship weapons on the Prometheus class, but once Asgard plasma beam technology was added to the BC-304s, the railguns became more of a secondary weapon and a point defense system. Their effectiveness depends heavily on the target. Against small fighters, they are extremely dangerous, with only a few hits often being enough to destroy a dart or a death glider. Against larger unshielded ships, however, their performance varies. Concentrated railgun fire could seriously damage an unshielded Assyrian Aurora-class battleship, while against the enormous Wraith hive ships, they were ineffective. Also, the railguns were essentially useless against powerful active shields used by Ori or even the Goa'uld. This gives the Stargate railgun a clear place in the setting. It isn't a super weapon, but a high rate of fire kinetic cannon that is extremely effective against fighters and unshielded targets, while also becoming far less useful against heavily protected capital ships. Then the Thanix series of cannons from the Mass Effect games takes the idea of a railgun and pushes it into a much more advanced form. They were developed by the Turians after studying the main weapons of the Reaper Sovereign. The Thanix uses a liquid metal alloy which is made from iron, uranium, and tungsten, which is held in an electromagnetic field and accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light. This projectile effectively solidifies as it leaves the weapon, turning a stream of molten metal into an incredibly powerful kinetic penetrator. The weapon can fire approximately once every 5 seconds, and the Thanix was eventually scaled up for larger warships including dreadnoughts, which makes it one of the most powerful kinetic weapons in Mass Effect. The dreadnought railguns run through much of the length of the ship and uses electromagnetic acceleration combined with Mass Effect technology to enhance their power. The most famous example was when Gunnery Chief from Mass Effect 2 describes a 20-kilogram projectile traveling at more than 1% the speed of light, striking with an energy comparable to a 38-kiloton nuclear explosion. This represents one of the ideas behind railgun tech in real life and sci-fi as well, which is the faster the slug travels, the more destructive they become. Now, the railguns from Babylon 5 are an interesting example of a weapon that exists somewhat in the background of the setting rather than being one of its main technologies. Most of the major warships we see here in this series rely on energy weapons like plasma, particle beams, and pulse cannons, so electromagnetic kinetic weapons can feel almost unusual by comparison. Yet the later Earth Alliance Earth Force designs, particularly the advanced Warlock class, shows that railguns had become part of the next generation of human weapons. Earth Force researchers were particularly interested in the Centauri's matter-based weapons and the principles behind their mass drivers, eventually developing a more refined electromagnetic weapon. Instead of simply throwing large quantities of metal towards an enemy, the railgun could launch a dense, carefully shaped projectile at an enormous speed, giving Earth Alliance ships later in the series a more accurate kinetic weapon for long-range combat, even challenging the Sharlan cruisers of the Minbari. What makes the railgun's place in Babylon 5 interesting, though, is precisely how vague and underexplored it remains. This series never turns them into the defining weapons of Earth Force in a way that other science fiction settings do, yet their existence suggests that they are an important technological evolution that is happening behind the scenes. Now, more famously, we have the magnetic accelerator cannons, or the MACs of Halo, which takes the concept of a spaceship railgun and scale it up to something much more brutal. Technically, most UNSC MAC guns are coil guns rather than true railguns, using a long series of electromagnetic coils to accelerate a projectile down the length of the weapon, but in practical terms, they fill the same role as gigantic railguns, acting as the main kinetic weapons of the UNSC warships. These guns can fire multi-ton projectiles at extraordinary speed and velocities, with the largest orbital MACs launching 3,000-ton slugs at around 4% the speed of light. The ammunition itself varies enormously, from roughly 160-ton projectiles used by smaller ships to the enormous depleted uranium and tungsten-based rounds which we see in the orbital defense platforms and the UNSC Infinity. Some of these mags can even fire specialized ammunition, including EMP rounds, while the massive mags aboard the Infinity can accommodate different types of heavy and sub-caliber munitions. This gives the UNSC a remarkable amount of flexibility, because the mag is not simply a single giant cannon. It is an entire family of electromagnetic weapons built around different ships, different calibers and tactical roles. The sheer power of these weapons comes from the combination of enormous projectile mass and extreme velocity. A 3,000-ton projectile accelerated to 4% the speed of light carries an enormous, absurd amount of kinetic energy, placing the impact energy at roughly 50 to 60 gigatons of TNT, which means it is more than 1,000 times as powerful as the SAR bomber, and that could take out a small moon. The weapon's huge size also explains why mags are unusually spinally mounted, with the entire spacecraft effectively built around the gun. Well, if we're talking about the super heavy mags of the orbital defense platforms and the Infinity. In Halo, the mag becomes more than just a weapon, and it becomes more like the defining feature of our species' offensive attitude, which makes a relatively conventional human warship able to challenge technologically superior aliens through sheer kinetic force. The result is one of science fiction's most famous examples of the idea that you don't always need an exotic energy weapon to destroy a spaceship. You just need to fire something really fast and really accurate. Now lastly, when we take things to 11, we're talking about the grim dark galaxy. The Nova Cannon of Warhammer 40,000 takes the idea of a spaceship railgun and pushes it into the realm of a true superweapon. These here are mounted deep within the heavily armored prows of Imperial battle cruisers and battleships. These enormous cannons use gravimetric acceleration to launch shells weighing tens of thousands of tons at a significant fraction of the speed of light. So even before the warhead detonates, the kinetic impact of such a projectile would be insane. At the suggested speeds of roughly 1.5 to even just 2% of the speed of light, a shell weighing tens of thousands of tons could carry the kinetic energy on the order of hundreds of gigatons of TNT, depending on the mass and the velocity. Yet the kinetic impact is almost secondary to what happens next. Nova Cannon shells can carry different kinds of devastating warheads, including plasma, gravitic, electromagnetic, and even warp-based vortex weapons. A plasma shell here could produce an enormous explosion capable of crippling capital ships, even shielded ones, while a grav shell can unleash an artificial gravitational force across thousands of kilometers. The most terrifying variants can even tear into the rift of the warp itself, destroying all within the affected area. The weapon, however, is massive, inaccurate, and difficult to fire. Its tremendous recoil means that only the largest Imperial vessels have the engines and the structure necessary to handle such a weapon. It is also much less useful at close range because of the collateral damage it might cause. So a Nova Cannon is instead a long-range artillery weapon in space, designed to unleash destruction over an enormous area. In that sense, it represents one of the most extreme stages in the evolution of the fictional railgun. The projectile has become so massive, the acceleration so powerful, and the ammunition so destructive that the weapon is no longer simply just a cannon, but a ship-mounted artillery system capable of destroying anything unlucky enough to be its target, or should I say, its victim, and that includes even small moons. Now with that, we come to the end of the video on the railguns and how powerful they can get in science fiction. So do hit the like button for support and also click that bell button for regular updates on new video uploads. Also subscribe to be a part of Legion Notebook. And till the next time, take care, boys.